Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Discussion Bound. My name is Kristi McMillan. I'm the Director of Learning and Engagement here at the Asheville Art Museum. And we are here today to discuss the book Hidden in Plain View, A Secret Story of Quilts and the Underground Railroad as part of our monthly Discussion Bound series. Discussion Bound is an opportunity for us to read readings, books, poems, things that relate to the museum's collection of American art of the 20th and 21st century, to discuss them together and to learn from and about each other. A few notes before we get started. You notice that when you got logged on that your microphone and video were muted by default. Please do at any time feel free to turn on your video so that we're not having a conversation with square black rectangles or photographs, still photographs of people, but that we can see each other's faces. In just a moment, I will also make it so that folks can unmute themselves. Choose a quiet room and close the door. Silence any alerts from nearby devices. When you have your microphone turned on, those beeps and ticks can be pretty distracting from the conversation. If you do turn on your video, try not to sit in front of a window, lamp, or other strong source of light or movement. Use headphones and microphone for best sound quality. While you can log on using your smartphone, we do recommend using a desktop, tablet, or laptop in order to see slides and meeting tools on a larger screen. Make sure that your screen name includes your first name and last initial, or first name and last name, again, so that while we're having a conversation, we know who we're talking to. In order to ask questions or make comments throughout the program, you'll be welcome to unmute your microphone when I ask for questions or comments. You can also type any questions or comments that you have into the chat box. A third way to participate is to raise your hand in the participant sidebar, and when there's a lull in conversation, I'll call on you and ask you to unmute your microphone. This is sometimes a long time getting to raise hands, so please do feel free to unmute your microphone when I ask for questions or comments. Finally, we are recording, so if you prefer not to be recorded, make sure that your video and audio remain muted and use the chat box to submit questions and comments. As always, I put together just a short list of questions to guide our conversation, which we can use or not. But I wanted to, instead of just keeping them on the screen the whole time, just go over them quickly together so that you can see sort of what I was thinking, but also I can come back to them later once they're off the screen. First, my first question is always going to be, what were your general impressions of the book? So we can get started with that question. My second question was that the impetus for this research was an oral tradition passed down in one family matrilineally. Is oral history, in your opinion, more or less reliable than written history, and why? I think this question of oral versus written history is very important, not only in this book, but also in the research surrounding it. So I thought that it would be a really good opportunity for us to really consider oral history versus written history and the pros and cons of each. Which leads to my third question: is written history subjective or objective, infallible or immutable? And I pulled this quote from the book that I thought would be a good jumping off point for us, that history is defined as a flow of events over time. Who chooses the events to be documented and remembered dictates history. For some time now, the history of the Underground Railroad has been written and told from the point of view of Northern abolitionists through a romantic rendering of the places and people involved. This romantic rendering told an American story, but neglected the African American story. What is missing from this American story is the involvement of the slaves themselves in their own story. Next, the authors posit different devices that quilters used to communicate vital information with enslaved people who couldn't read, such as patterns, mnemonic devices, and knots. I found the conversation around knots to be really fascinating, and that they parallel other coded ways of conveying information, such as simple substitution codes and double meanings in song. What are ways that people can communicate with others besides written language? And I think this is really rich to think about. Another quote that I thought was really thought-provoking was communicating secrets using ordinary objects is very much a part of African culture, in which familiarity provides the perfect cover. Messages can be skillfully passed on through objects that are seen so often they become invisible. Thirdly, I think that it's really important to acknowledge that since this book came out, and I think it was 1999 that it was published, that some scholars have disputed the validity of this research owing to the lack of written evidence and multiple firsthand sources to support Tobin and Dobard's research. Do you agree or disagree, and why? And then finally, how did this book expand your knowledge of American history? What was something interesting that you learned? And please share it with the group. So what I'll do is I'll stop sharing my screen now so that I can see all of you. I've also made it that you all can unmute yourselves, and let's just jump into the conversation. What did you think overall? What were your general impressions of this book? Go for it, Pat.
Oh, okay. Well,
you cleared your throat meaningfully.
Right. Yeah, I found the book interesting, pretty fascinating, actually. Relating a lot to what I kind of heard as a child, because I have grandparents in Alabama and Tennessee. I did feel it asked more questions than it really answered, which was a little frustrating.
Why did you find that frustrating?
Well, it makes me want to read more and find out. And I was really glad that you said that more research has been done, because I am going to pursue it a little bit more and look into it and all. But yeah, it was a good read. I really enjoyed it. Thank you for selecting it.
Yeah, thanks, Pat. Thanks for reading it. Other general impressions of the book? Go ahead, Christina. Can't hear you.
Okay.
There you go.
Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
I enjoyed it a great deal because I must confess that it was something that I didn't know anything about. I don't have a really strong, unlike Pat, I don't have a strong background in American history. I was born and raised and grew up in Latin America and went to Spanish schools, and I learned the Latin American history before I ever learned American history. That's no excuse, but I found it fascinating. It had never occurred to me that this could be happening. I found it quite detailed. So at times I had, because I'm not a quilter, that was another thing I thought was a little bit of a handicap, in that all these quilt patterns and the knots and all these things that were introduced in this book were, I would have liked to sit through a couple of lectures. I would like to take a class on this where somebody would actually show me, I could see, you know, what was sort of being presented in the book. And there was a lot of information. I think that whole, I mean, it's a whole other thing, this question of oral versus written. And
yeah, we can dive deeper into that too.
Yeah, the struggle of these researchers to lend validity to what they were trying to write this book about. Anyway, it's a, I won't go on and on, but I found it a fascinating read, and I'm glad I read it, and it's opened up another world for me to continue to explore.
Thanks, Christina. I guess you'll be picking up some books on quilt making now.
Yeah.
Other thoughts, other general impressions of the book?
So I'm Norma Bradley.
Hey, Norma.
I am a quilt artist.
Yay! I was hoping that someone would be.
I spent 30 years in schools talking to children about quilts. So I obviously did a lot of research.
Educate us.
Yeah, it's just amazing. I attended an amazing Symposium in 1999.
Same year that this book was written.
When the book was written, and this is the other book, Communion of the Spirits, which actually I borrowed from the library. Can you see it?
I'm going to type it in the chat box. Keep holding it up for a minute.
Communion of the Spirits by Roland Freeman.
Got it. Thank you.
A photographer and documented quilts throughout the country for 20 years. It was at the symposium was with quilt makers from all over the world, and all the famous historians of quilts were there. It was just an accident that I was there, and it was wonderful. Anyway, they did have a panel to discuss this particular book. That was
the book that we've read, or the book that you held up?
No, the Hidden in Plain View.
Okay.
And Tobin was there.
Mm-hmm.
And it was really interesting to hear the discussion. There were a few people who disputed, you know, that maybe this isn't so, maybe the symbols aren't, that we're making this up. And I believe it from all my research. I mean, there are symbols in all art, you know, and when people are creating, you know, symbols come out. I mean, that's at another level. And I really looked at a lot of quilts, and you can really see the different symbols coming out. I mean, the Masonic tradition has symbols all over it. So I think it was a delightful book to read. I was very excited to read it. I actually went to South Carolina to what was called the slave market, and walked through there, and it was kind of interesting to do that. But if you want to read another book about the history of quilt making throughout the country, I suggest you read this book because it's beautiful. And I found it in the library, and then I ended up buying it.
Okay, just the local Buncombe County Library?
Yeah,
okay, well, I'm sure Christina will be on the wait list when you give it back, Norma.
It's beautiful. I mean, the images in it and the stories, and it's the collectors and the quilt makers. So, you know, Maya Angelou was a collector, and it's just wonderful. So, yeah, I believe it. I love the book. And I must say that in cleaning out my large collection of books, I did let that particular one go. And then when this came about, I said, oh, why did I do that? You know,
we always have book cleaning out regrets.
Yeah.
Kathy had asked Norma, where did that conference take place? And was there a special occasion for the conference, or was it just sort of quilt making in general?
The conference took place in DC at the African Museum.
Okay.
And the African American Museum, and it was, I don't know why they decided to do it. Roland Freeman was the person who kind of got all people together, but there were people from different countries, and they managed to raise money for Bangladesh, for different communities that needed it right then and there, and got different ideas so that different people could actually continue doing the needlework and making money out of it all over the world.
Great. Thanks, Norma. And I did put the title of that book over in the chat box. Other folks want to share their general impressions of the book?
I thought it was a little far-fetched that a quilt could give you a map of how to escape slavery. As I was going through it, I was looking for what's the secret? How did they find their way out? And by the end of the book, I realized it was really more of a mental map to get you psyched into getting the courage to leave because others had gone before you. So I enjoyed it very much. I found it fascinating.
Thanks, Joey. Yeah, the secret that was it Mrs. Williams or Mrs. McDaniel sort of gave us at the beginning was this. And then I thought, wait, I don't understand a word of this. So it's like the rest of the book was sort of trying to explain aspects of that secret, trying to unpack this, what had been pretty think, sort of simply presented and transmitted, but I guess isn't that the point of a mnemonic device? It's supposed to be simple so that you can remember it, but then it has all sorts of meanings that mnemonic device helps you to remember.
Kristi,
Ginger,
this is-
you've got your camera on.
Yeah, I can't find my little hand to wave though.
Hi.
I wanted to follow up with what Joey just said
Sure.
by telling you an oral story from my neighbor who lives next door to me. I'm in Waynesville, and she told me, she's probably 85, 87. She grew up in a very rural area of Haywood County called Allens Creek. And she said that when she was growing up in the 30s and the revenuers were in town, everybody knew to hang up a white sheet. And that would go from neighborhood to neighborhood to put your stuff up because the revenuers were in town. So I think it's really interesting, you know, that people have ways of communicating that we may not know of.
Or that everyone knows about. I'm thinking about when I was driving home the other night, a car sort of flashed its lights at me. So I knew that I needed to slow down because there was a cop up ahead. And it's one of those things, it's like, it's ways that we communicate without words, but people know what it means if you're meant to know what it means, right? And I think that was the premise of this book, was that the knowledge that those quilts imparted or may have imparted was known by the people who needed to know it. And if you didn't need to know it, you didn't know what it meant. It was one of those things that that second quote that I had put up, that communicating secrets with using ordinary objects, that familiarity provides the perfect cover. Messages can be skillfully passed on through objects that are seen so often they become invisible. And I think this happens all the time. We have selective hearing, selective memory, because there's so much sensory information coming into our brains on an instantaneous basis that our brains sort of learn how to privilege information, prioritize information, and know what to forget. And that, you know, I say this all the time to my colleagues, well, 3 of you please read what I wrote, because I've looked at it so much now I can't even read it or understand it anymore. Or you say, I'm going to put something back and come back with fresh eyes, then it's no longer as familiar to your brain. Betty, you have your hand up. Can't hear you, Betty.
Mute.
There you go.
So I thought the book overall was very interesting, but I thought the ties back to Africa were also very, very interesting, and really provided a rich background for understanding the communication patterns. And I thought some of the things about, like this, the place of the blacksmith in Africa, and then in some of the African American communities, was interesting. I thought there were some things added that I really hadn't heard before, and that really were added a richness to the background of and added continuity to the life, so that we don't just think of people as during the period when they were enslaved, but we have some understanding going back of their heritage, which often has been lost for people, but in this case was claimed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I thought a lot about that, Betty. I thought that the authors went sort of back to African roots pretty often, and I wasn't sure how I felt about that, because I thought, is it fair to think that because something happens in Africa, it would continue to happen in America if people were generations removed from that source? But then I started to look at when, and I still didn't find the exact answer. Maybe some of you here know. That's the beauty of having a group of knowledgeable people to talk to. When were, I guess, what am I trying to say? Enslaved Africans coming over on ships, so sort of first generation Africans, that was outlawed, I think, if I'm not mistaken, at the end of the 18th century, but that it continued to happen illegally well into the 19th century. And so then I thought, well, okay, then I'm not being very fair then, because there were plenty of enslaved people that still had those contacts back to Africa and would have had either the direct knowledge or knowledge passed on to them by their parents. So go ahead, Judy.
Yeah, also, if you think about it, I mean, my ancestors came from Scotland and England, and they brought their religious beliefs and their traditions with them, which are very much alive today.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so I don't know why it would be different from people coming from Africa or anywhere else, actually. And maybe because the people being written about in this book were not allowed to express themselves, to progress, to learn, to, you know, create, to innovate. Those traditions and beliefs were kind of even more tightly held. Just speculation, but I loved this book. I first saw it in 1999 when two high school students wanted to do a presentation. They could choose anything they wanted as a project, and they chose codes and quilts. And I had no idea what they were talking about. I'd never heard this in my patriarchal white, you know, Western upbringing. And so I found it fascinating, and reading it, I loved the combination of scholarship and narrative. And with the glossary and it's like a hybrid poetry book or something. It's just wonderful. I don't think I really care whether the details of the scholarship are accurate. I mean, it's always good to find accuracy at some point, but at this point, what I admire most is that this this information you know, has been brought out and pulled together, and so we can look at alternatives to abolitionist stories.
Right.
Or alternatives to white patriarchal, you know, Western stories.
Yeah.
Were your students African-American students?
No, they weren't, but I ran this program that I basically said, you know, every Friday you can choose any subject you want, and you can link it to your 4 academic subjects, and I will bring in people from the community to guide you. And they chose everything from chocolate to poisons in literature to this. It was in a school where there was only one African-American student who chose
How do you
surfing.
think these students knew about coding and quilts?
I don't know, and I probably asked them, and I don't remember. It might have been brought up by a teacher in one of their classes. It was a pretty progressive school started by a bunch of musicians, so, you know.
Everything comes full circle, right, Judy?
Yeah, it does. It really does.
Kathy? You're muted. Kathy? You're muted, Kathy. There you go.
I had my mouse elsewhere. Yeah, I really enjoyed the book as well, and I wasn't so concerned about, you know, is an oral history accurate, because really before the internet, much of history, aside from being written, was oral. And I'm sure that, you know, yes, many of the first slaves that came over perhaps didn't know how to write, and education was also, they were deprived of education once they were here. So I really like the kind of the secretive aspect of it, and the fact that Ozella, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, waited for the author to be ready to write this down, and it was very mysterious the way she did so. I think for me, the quilt code was one of many different things that were used in for the Underground Railroad. And they mentioned in the book the lawn figure with the light on as well or off. I was concurrently reading about Lincoln's Secretary of State, William Seward, in the Finger Lakes and Auburn and such, and his wife, who was very involved with abolitionism and the women's rights movement in Seneca Falls. But it was fascinating how it kind of was all coming together, and how frightening for, you know, like the fugitive slaves and such when that law was passed. So it had to be secret, I think. And, you know, the only other thing I wanted to mention is because I was reading this in-depth article in the New Yorker about Seward and then Lincoln and the Emancipation Proclamation and such. If you look at the South and then you go straight up, of course, you're going through the Virginias and Pennsylvania, and then you are in New York. Growing up in New York and living for 10 years in the Adirondacks as well, if you look at that east side of the mountain range, the Appalachian mountain range, it goes straight up into Canada. And I know in the Adirondacks there were camps and some large, let's say, hotels and B&Bs and such that were part of the Underground Railroad. And that kind of jogged that memory when I was reading this book, and I could see that bigger picture.
Thank you. So let's talk about oral history versus written history, because I think that, to my mind, the authors right at the beginning said, this is a theory. We don't have a lot of firsthand accounts written at the time. We don't have the sort of traditional support that historians have when they are, you know, presenting new research. This is more of a theory and something that we're putting forward, and we're hoping that, you know, that the evidence will come out to support. That was very clear to me. And so I felt like maybe some of the criticism of the book was a little bit unfair, because I felt like they said that right at the beginning, and they're inviting people to then contribute to the conversation, you know, whether with evidence or against it. I felt like that was clear from the beginning. But I also felt that the whole premise of the book throws out for consideration the validity of oral tradition or oral history versus written history, and whether written history is somehow more valuable than oral history if written history is subjective or objective. I thought a lot about that as I was reading this book, and I'm really interested to hear about what you think. Is oral history somehow more valuable or less valuable, or more reliable or less reliable than written history? And why do you think so?
No, it might depend on the value to whom. I mean,
Human knowledge.
Oh, okay.
I mean, sort of in general.
Okay.
But if you have specific thoughts, I'm happy to hear those too.
Yeah, I don't much trust oral history, but then there's a lot of written history that's bogus too, and very one-sided, you know. But I know there's this guy named Sam Lee who's a musician, and he was given permission by the Romani, the travelers in Scotland, to use their songs, which are essentially their oral history, and to arrange them. And that's, I mean, he's devoted his life to doing this. And to hear him talk about it, I realized that the oral history for the travelers is extremely important to them. he has made their oral history through their songs important to other people too. I mean, he's expanded, you know, their reach. But I'm not sure the problem with oral history, the problem I personally have with oral history is that every time you hear a conversation or a fact repeated, even by reputable news sources, it is altered a little bit. A different word is used, you know, so, and it's hard to dig back, it's hard to get back to the source. So in terms of accuracy, I think that's a real problem. But when people weren't literate, I think we have to give more weight to their oral history, because that's the method they had, their songs and their dances and their symbols and their, you know, their tellings. And we have to put weight somewhere. So I think we have to give weight to that for as long as we can, until maybe we find out something different.
Thanks, Judy. Christina?
I didn't have a problem with it, as you said, Christy, because right from the very beginning, I knew this was oral history. But when you think about the history of the Underground Railroad and how it's really told from the perspective of white people, then I think opening up and reading something that's oral history makes you think that, or it opens up your mind to the possibility that maybe what we have learned all along, maybe there's another side to this that we hadn't considered before. And that's sort of what I thought about while I was reading this, plus the fact that the people telling this oral history were illiterate. They were not allowed to learn to read and write. They were not allowed to have paper, pencil, anything of the sort. So the fact that some of this got passed down orally, whether it's 100% accurate or not, I felt had validity of some sort. And I also agree that written history is often can be very one-sided as well, depending on who's writing the history, unless it's there in black and white and there is no other side to it.
Yeah, thank you, Christina. What is writing? Writing is making a mark on something that then you or someone else can come back and read later. We happen to read Latin characters that then correspond with our spoken language. But I don't think that if there were a system of writing in quilts that communicated information, that should be any less valid than, you know, me writing in my really bad handwriting something that I want to remember later, right? So it's a form of mark making that you or someone else can read later to get that information out of it. I think, Judy, what I thought a lot about with the oral history was they talked about the griots in Africa, that it was their job in the culture to learn the stories, to remember them, to recite them, and to pass them on. And that job is just important as any other job that you do over a number of years and perfect. So it's not my job to remember things. So when I tell you a story and then you tell that story to someone and then a fourth person tells that story, none of our jobs is to remember something word for word. But if it were the griot's job to remember, then why wouldn't the same stories from griot to griot to griot be the same, with the same words, the same characters, etc.? Because it's their job. It's what they do.
I think that's a really legitimate point, and
Mhm.
one I wasn't thinking about when I was speaking before.
Yeah, I went down a rabbit hole just thinking about sort of the implications of this.
It's all about replicability, I think.
Mhm.
You know, if there are marks, whether they're in quilts or in anything that, you know, that lasts, they can be checked by people, you know, by later people. You know, so oral history, I don't know. You know, I know that the travelers only in Scotland only allow certain people to sing their songs and arrange them and that kind of thing. They're very strict about it. And perhaps the same was the case with the griots, and, you know, so,
Yeah.
yeah.
But I thought a lot about that, and that by privileging written history, you're privileging your society or your culture's way of doing things.
Absolutely.
I
Pat,
love
you had your
that.
hand up.
Yeah, I was just going to say there are two things that kind of play into this as well, and that's the vulnerability of the quilt itself. You know,
Right.
so by the time they're trying to legitimize this, they don't have as much to kind of look back on. And then the very fact that there were not people alive that could verify necessarily, you know, when this was happening. By the time they wrote this book, it had been, you know, a very long time. And so they were dependent on people that had just heard it.
Mhm.
And so, yeah, two, I think, very critical facts that we have to, you know, consider when we read this book.
That's a good point, Pat, because I think one of the things that scholars have sort of questioned since this book came out was that there wasn't discussion in the 1930s interviews with former enslaved people that were conducted by the WPA to support this idea. But by the 1930s, you know, how much of that knowledge would still have been known if this was, you know, 70 years, 65 years, 70 years after the Civil War, were some of these former enslaved people children at the time, so they wouldn't have had that knowledge or wouldn't have shared it? Or was it knowledge that could have been something, again, that was passed on sort of through families that you didn't talk about? There was a quote in the book, forgive me, a need for secrecy is understandable when we consider that from the time of slavery until today, secrecy was one way the Black community could protect itself. If the white man didn't know what was going on, he couldn't seek reprisals. Secrecy appears to be wedded to protection and becomes a matter of family honor. You do not tell strangers what is kept sacred to the family. If an elder binds you to secrecy on his or her deathbed, you never break that bond. Racial hostility and mistrust work hand in hand to keep things secret.
In defense of oral history, written history is notoriously unreliable.
And that was my second point. That was my second point, Joey. So talk more about that.
Well, it's someone's interpretation of events, and it's not necessarily true or wholesome, fulsome. It's not the whole story. You're getting, as Christina said, a version of it, or a side of it. So,
yeah. Other thoughts on that? Is written history subjective, objective? Is it infallible? Is it unchallengeable? Is it immutable? Is it unchangeable?
Hey, I've worked in science labs where it's supposed to be objective,
Yeah.
where studies are designed, and it's not.
Right.
It really is appalling.
And why? Because humans are not perfect.
Exactly.
We're not computers, and we all record things
lazy.
from our own point of view. We are inherently selfish beings.
And we are lazy, and we want to support our point. So we select what supports our point. You know, That the fallibility of written accounts doesn't make oral accounts any better. I mean, just because written accounts
No,
fallible doesn't mean oral.
exactly.
But I think any account that comes from humans has to be questioned.
Right. But even, you know, we talk about, you know, in our docent trainings and in conversations with visitors, even photography, which you would think it is the recording of reality. It is 100% manipulable. I don't know how to say that, but able to be manipulated by the person behind the camera.
Mhm.
And selection alone.
Right.
I mean, that one thing, what you select to shoot, to paint, to write, to say, you know,
Yeah.
as
Go
what
ahead,
Joey said.
Kathy.
Yeah, I mean, what's that other saying, you know, take it with a grain of salt. And, you know, I think there's so much information. I mean, especially in today's world with social media and all, that, you know, if you read something or learn something, and what is that saying? If it smells like a fish, it probably is. You know, you get a little instinct that way too, which is not academic and it's not scientific. But the thing I really wanted to mention is that it's plausibility as well. And it's fully plausible, given how repressed and tortured, suppressed, and in fear the African Americans who were enslaved were in those days. I'm sure they wouldn't have, even if they could have written this down. And as I mentioned earlier, I think it was one of a number of different things that perhaps helped them, and that's just my gut kind of feeling. But it's very plausible that they would not have written it down, and I do believe in oral history accounts with that caveat of, you know, plausibility.
Thanks, Kathy. So
Mhm.
what are some ways that we communicate without words? I thought then a lot about that. This book did so much for me to think about communication and how we communicate and what's reliable. I thought about sign language. I thought about flags that boats use to communicate to other boats when they're far away from each other. You know, this system of sort of sending a message through flags. What other ways do we communicate without words?
Bumper stickers.
I don't know. A lot of times those use words, Betty,
Yeah.
and some of
That's
them are
true.
not too nice.
Well, I was trying, am I muted?
You're
No.
fine, Pat.
Okay, good. I was thinking actually in our new world of Zoom, the limitations of Zoom, and a big limitation of Zoom is you're not with the people, so you don't see the reactions, the body language, just the general demeanor
Yeah.
of people. And so as you're talking about these limitations, I think that's a huge one in our new world here.
So yeah, body language. Communication is 90% body language, right?
Exactly.
So the
Yeah.
things that we communicate
Mhm.
without words, just as human beings, right?
Yeah.
Emojis.
Emojis, yeah,
Yeah.
which tries to, in some way, replicate body language, right, Joey? Norma?
Oh, I was just thinking, when you take your driver's test, or you know, have to look at all the symbols and they take away what's on there,
Mhm.
you're remembering by symbols, by
Yeah.
shape.
Right. With the idea that these symbols, the shapes, the colors, the relative size, the way that those things are combined,
Yeah.
are there because not every sign can be read by every person, and not every thing that you need to communicate, you can communicate in words, right?
Mhm.
So, yeah, I mean, you have I mean, not so much the ones that are used in America. America always has to be different. But, you know, the sort of international road signs that are throughout Europe and Asia and Africa, it's sort of that common language when we don't speak the same language, but it's a way for us all to understand the same thing.
Sure.
Good example, Norma.
One of the other things I was thinking about in my own research is that the women slaves who made the quilts, a lot of them were seamstresses for the main house, for the big house. And they knew how to do all the patterns that white people wanted. And when they made their own quilts, they did not use those patterns. They did their own story. And I just love noticing that and also reading about it. And the other thing I read is that when the slaves were running in the Underground Railroad, not only did they put quilts up, but sometimes they would draw a pattern. The log cabin pattern was a pretty popular one, or going north, in front of the house, so that when the slaves were running, they knew that that was a safe house.
Or not. I think that there was, and Christina, you brought this up in our conversation on Friday, the center color of the quilt, what the authors had posited was having yellow or orange, which were not at all traditional colors to have as the center square, that had particular meaning, that particular house or structure was a safe place.
And also, when I moved here 40 years ago from Manhattan, I lived on a farm in Sandy Mush, and some of my neighbors did not read or write. But I really learned so much from them and would love hiking with them, and they knew that I was interested in what they would tell me. So a lot of the facts that they told me, I didn't know if they were true or not, but later on, I did find out they were, you know, herbs and just different things to help you. And also just digging for arrowheads and, you know, which ones were in which field and why they were there. I mean, it was fascinating to me. I really learned a whole new way to be in the world.
Is anybody else besides me watching Masterpiece, All Creatures Great and Small?
Yes.
And what, you know, the learned veterinarian is learning from like the country people about animals. You know, he's supposed to know everything about them, but he's learning from his clients just as much as they're learning from him.
Yeah. I have a few other books
go ahead.
I'm going to let you know about. I have one called Stitched from the Soul, which is written by a historian with a PhD. And this has a lot of information, and also Signs and Symbols. Another one that is, you know, documented in.
I think I've seen that one. Would you mind emailing me the titles and authors of those 3 books? What I can do is I'll hold sending out the evaluation today until I get that email from you, Norma. So send it to me ASAP. And that way, if folks are interested into delving in more, you've got some recommendations from Norma. But I thought a lot about classes that I've taken in, for example, medieval art history, and the way that art was used to communicate with the masses. That people, unless you were a priest or a member of the aristocracy, you didn't learn to read. It just wasn't something that you did. And so the Bible was taught to people, morality was taught to people, ethics were taught to people through pictures, and that you learned how to be in the world, and you learned these stories through images that were encoded with knowledge that was taught to you so that you could understand it. Somebody mentioned in the chat box colors. Absolutely. In Western culture, colors have meaning, and so those colors were then used in those paintings or sculptures in order to teach people who couldn't read something about them. Or certain you know, iconology, certain symbols. You think of, you know, the flowers. So for example, someone holding a lily was meant to be, you know, pure or virginal. I mean, there are so many ways that we use to communicate that have nothing to do with words. And they could have written volumes and volumes of that in order just to support this idea that yes, human beings, we have different ways to communicate with each other that have nothing to do with written language. So, you know, having this idea of gaining knowledge from quilts, it's not at all groundbreaking. It's just ways that we do as human beings. Judy, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I something that stopped me and I've been thinking about ever since in the book was the idea, which I hadn't known, that the devil or evil spirits, I guess, bad spirits, travel in a straight line. And so that explains possibly a lot of the jigs and jags and, you know, lack of straight lines in some of the quilt patterns.
There was the drunkard's path
The
pattern,
drunkard's path.
especially. I kept looking at it and trying to figure out how it was pieced.
Yeah, beautiful. It's really beautiful design, I thought. But it made me wonder how much of our own sort of tradition of reading, we read left to right, top to bottom, and other things, determines how we sort of see the world. You know, I used to live in Manhattan too, and downtown, and I would marvel at how when people came to visit from the Midwest where I grew up, they didn't know how to walk down the sidewalk because there were so many people. You have to do it a certain way, right? Norma, you're laughing. And here, I had a friend from Manhattan visit me here, and she was cutting in front of people in stores. And I had to say, you know, don't do that. First of all, it's an open carry state. Second of all, you know, that's very rude here because there's space here. There, you know, and I just think there's so much of what we do that involves coded messages and understandings that we just aren't aware of because, as you said in the very beginning, Kristi, you know, we have learned them and we do them automatically.
Right. And think about our brains. When we are born, our brains can absorb anything at all. We can speak any language, we can learn anything. And as we grow and our brains develop, our brains then start to say, okay, this sound that you're making is important in this language. So now I can forget how to say these 1,000 other sounds that you don't need in this language so that you can have room to remember other things. And, you know, there are just, I mean, we have to admit there's so much we don't know, and that's okay. We can learn if we're meant to. But I think that it's not at all unreasonable to think that there's a whole language of quilts, a whole way of communicating that we don't know because we were never meant to know. Why would we know that? So then why, when we look at it, we wouldn't even see it and wonder what it was because it wasn't even something that we would have thought of that it might have encoded knowledge in it. Kathy, you had said in the chat box, you were talking about the Jacqueline quilt that we talked about that's in the museum's collection. We talked about it at Slow Art Friday this past week, and that it was called by Amelia Bennett a housetop pattern, which if you notice throughout Hidden in Plain View, the same patterns were referred to in different ways. And I believe that housetop is the way that the quilters of Jacqueline refer to their variation of log cabin. So Norma, you can talk maybe a little bit about that as our resident quilter, that same patterns can have different names to different people.
Yes, patterns, it's regional. It became regional as to the name of the pattern. And I just had the honor of working with the Jacqueline quilters. And, you know, just, they just took it in a whole much more creative way, and made their own designs and their own patterns, and followed, some of them followed the traditional ones, but there's always a variation. But yeah, it's regional as to what they name the quilts.
Mhm.
Same patterns, you know, have different names.
So Kathy, you're muted. Yeah, that's the log cabin.
Yeah.
Joey?
That's the log cabin. And if you go to the museum site, you can find, I thought it would be that, because you can see Amelia Bennett scrap up on the museum's website, which they call a housetop, but
Right.
that was the closest thing I could get to it.
And hers is also bigger too. It takes up the entire quilt rather than multiple squares forming it.
And
Joey?
there are variations of the same pattern as well.
Right. Go ahead, Joey.
I was just following up on something there was little tidbits in this book that I didn't know about and I found interesting. To Judy's point of evil travels in a straight line, that superstition, and the broken plate pattern, and the use of broken plates on grave sites to keep the deceased away from the living people, and also the broken pattern would allow them to ascend to wherever they were going to ascend to. But it reminded me of, you know, reading the book, I thought of all the things in the museum that had new meaning to me, like the Whitfield Lovell wall sculpture of
with the broken plates.
china, and
Yeah.
the charcoal old picture of the woman on wood. I just thought, oh my God, that has a layer of meaning I didn't realize it had before.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And that meaning was there. We just didn't know it.
Right.
So it's not that it didn't exist just because we didn't know. I think that's really interesting. Thanks, Joey. Christina, I think you had your hand up too.
Well, that kind of in a obtuse way goes along with having read this book, or actually in anticipation of reading this book. I came across an article in the New York Times art section. Every stitch tells a story, and it's related to the Black Lives Matter movement and how the African American quilters got busy making quilts after the George Floyd incident, and how there were these exhibitions that were going to happen in the Minneapolis and the Minnesota area, and traveling exhibitions. And when I saw this, it's a way of expression, which I thought sort of went along with what we learned in this book. And I probably wouldn't have given this a second, you know, I would have been just leafing through the art section, but I really stopped and paid attention and looked at, as Joy was saying, go through the museum and all of a sudden you look at things in a different way. And that was one of the enriching benefits, whether oral or written history is more reliable, whatever. I think the takeaway is that you begin to look at things perhaps a little more in a different perspective than you had thought about before. I like that. And
it's one of the benefits of growing older, is we have time to read and educate ourselves.
Exactly. Exactly.
So that Joey and Christina started us off with my last question, and it's already 1 o'clock, but in the next couple of minutes, maybe we can end our discussion by pulling out those things that you found expanded your knowledge of American history, or something interesting that you learned. Anyone? Sandy, you sent me an email this morning.
Yeah, I am a docent at the University of Montana, and we just put up an African exhibit, and we all had to write little stories, and I had this sculpture that had an X on cheeks. And I just learned that that is a symbol for word or speech. So I'll have to add on to my right was crucial for this sculpture. I also learned about the brown patterns on cloths, that they were secret.
Mm-hmm.
Already the secrets, but this really embellished all of that. And who would have known that I would learn so much African history through this book?
Through this
I'm
book,
indebted
right?
to you all.
It's a jumping off point, Sandy. And in case you missed it, or in case anyone missed it, there's an extensive bibliography in the back of the book for further reading, as well as the glossary. So again, that was just one of those acknowledgements to me, saying that the authors knew that they were putting a new idea out in the world. And if folks were interested in reading more, learning more, doing more research, sort of adding or taking away from what they put out there, here are some places that you might start. Kathy, you had your hand up.
No, just that it gave me a great interest in going to Charleston and
Okay.
seeing the marketplace and the quilts and any of the sawgrass weavings and yeah. So I've never been to Charleston, and I am planning that.
Oh, that's a treat.
You'll have to report back, Kathy. Anybody else want to share something that they found interesting or that they've learned from this book?
I thought the issue of the blacksmith and the relationship of the drums and the language and everything. And I found that part very believable, you know, very believable, because apparently the plantation owners had banned drums and meeting. And so they did it with the blacksmith, you know, and the fact that he had a history in the culture before. So
yeah, I think that you might want to, Pat, just owing to that you work with metals as part of your artistry, maybe look at sort of the role, read a little bit more about the blacksmith's place in African society. I think that
like
you'd
I
really
said,
enjoy
this
that.
book is gem in making you want to learn more. And I think that's a good part of it.
Yeah. All right, folks, any last words?
Just thank you so much. This was
Thank
such
you.
a treat for me to revisit that book, and I'm going to get another copy of it and reread it again. And I learned a lot from all of you, and I really appreciated your thinking, Kristi, on this.
As I said, just like everyone else, if nothing more, this book got me thinking about a lot of things, and
Yeah,
I was grateful for that. It also, I really, as I often do, stop reading, put the book down, and start researching more about something very small that was said or mentioned. And then Saturday night, I hadn't seen it. I know, Kathy, you've recommended the movie Harriet to me that came out 2 years ago. And I watched that on Saturday night because they mentioned in passing that Harriet Tubman was a quilter. So I thought, oh, I wonder if there's anything about this in the movie. So there, I queued it up and watched it. Found that really great as well. So thank you all for coming. Next month, March 9th at 12 p.m., our book is called Women Who Read Are Dangerous by Stefan Bowman. And that, oh, Christina's holding it up. That's a book that I think is going to be really nice. Christina has already previewed it and will be leading that conversation. It pairs art with writing to look at what is so threatening about women reading throughout the ages, to really get us thinking about images and words and the role of women in society. So thank you, Christina, for suggesting that and for leading that conversation. And the other thing that I wanted to say, can't remember. I'm sure it'll come to me. So Norma, get me those links. Christina, somebody also asked about the article that you held up. If you wouldn't mind just sending me a reference to that, I will include these book and article references in my evaluation that I send you guys. Thanks again for coming. As always, I learn a lot. Take care. Enjoy the rest of your week.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.